Hello, welcome to another class in literature in English. Today we are going to look at two broad poems in the African category. The first is Gbemisola Adeoti's poem titled Ambush, and the second will be Patterson's poem titled The Panic of Growing Older. Now let's begin with Ambush. Now when we talk about this poem Ambush, the title of the poem suggests a lot of connotations. A quick background into this poem will reveal that it shows the level of political maladministration by so many African leaders, most especially in the post-colonial era. Now, before colonization, Africa was living a life of isolation, I should say. During the colonial era, many African countries, Nigeria inclusive, were clamoring for decolonization. They had always opted for this because they had believed that their major social and political problem was political domination by Western powers. But towards the end of colonization from 1960 upwards, we had noticed that Nigeria and the majority of African countries had begun to win decolonization. They had gained political independence and began to rule themselves. Now, the hope of many Africans and Nigerians after decolonization was that things will become so improved, the economy will be so wonderful, the political terrain and situation will improve. But the situation became an irony of our expectations. We began to see the downturn of events. In the Nigerian context, there were several economic giant strides as notably observed in the oil boom in Nigeria. Nigeria became economically viable and it was expected that a lot of things would change. But like I had said, this was an antithesis to our expectations. It is upon this background that Gbemisola Adeoti put up the poem Ambush. Now, from the denotative meaning of the poem Ambush, it simply means a technique which warriors or soldiers use to attack their enemies. They lay in wait secretly, unknown to their opponents, and of which the opponents encroach, they will rise and attack. This is the common meaning of the term ambush. But the poet speaker decided to use this poem to explain the frustrations of the common man in a post-colonial African society. It likens the African society as a group of soldiers who are laying in ambush to frustrate the dreams and aspirations of the African man. Now, let's read the poem Ambush. The lion is a giant whale that swallows the sinker with hook, line, and bait, aborting dreams of a good catch. Fishers turn home at dusk, blue peter on empty ships, all peters with petered out desires. The lion is a saber-toothed tiger that cries deep in the glade while infants shudder home. The grizzled ones snatch their guts from bayonets of tribulation, halting venturous walk at dusk. The lion is a giant hawk that cuts unceasing disaster as it hovers and hoots in space. The lion lies patiently ahead, awaiting in ambush those who point away from a direction where nothing happens towards the shore of possibility. Now, that is ambush. The poet has elaborately put up this poem, like I had said in the background to this study, to explain the frustrations of leaders and the African society at the time in order to frustrate the dreams of a common man. Now, if you look at the combinations and the comparisons used by the poet speaker, you will clearly understand that the land is being likened to three major predators. The first is a giant whale, which is a sea predator. The second of which we are going to see is a saber-toothed tiger, which is of course the land predator. And then the third is a giant hawk, which is an air predator who operates in aerial situations. Now, the poet segmentally used these three categories of predators to liken the authorizations and the abuse of power as put forward by the leaders of post-colonial African society. Now, in the first stanza of this poem, the land is a giant whale, of which that first line there is a metaphorical expression that likens the land and the giant whale, which is a very mighty and gigantic fish. He said this fish does what? Swallows the sinker with hook, line, and bait. Now you can imagine the hook, the line, and the bait, which perhaps a young fisherman uses to catch a fish of which he will take home for lunch or dinner. But the land of which the speaker had likened to be a giant whale swallows all of this: the line, the hook, the bait, and even the sinker. And when this happens, it aborts dreams of good catch, of which fishermen will turn home at dusk, blue Peter on empty ship, all Peters with petered out desires. Now that means that the poet speaker is explaining the level of frustration of the people who he likens to fishermen who will go out to fish, but the land does not support their dreams. It takes away everything they had to offer in exchange for their dreams, thereby making them return home. Blue Peter there is a metaphorical expression for tiredness. And then we see the empty ships, which means hopelessness and frustration, nothing to catch, having toiled the whole day in order to get something to eat. Now, in the second stanza, the poet moves away from the sea experience to the land experience when he said metaphorically that the land is a saber-toothed tiger that cries deep in the glade while infants shudder home. That is a clear show of an abuse of power. Now, the land here is metaphorically compared to a tiger who uses his power and strength in order to intimidate younger ones, of which the poet title is said, cries deep in the glade while infants shudder home. The grizzled ones search their guts from bareness of tribulation, thereby halting venturous walk at dusk. Of which this saber-toothed tiger will raise seriously its tone in deep glades, intimidating young animals, of which they will always run. Now, the poet now moves away from this second segment of the predators, of which we talked about the saber-toothed tiger, to an aerial predator, which is the giant hawk. He says the land is a giant hawk that causes unceasing disaster as it hovers and hoots in space. Now you can imagine the hawk, whenever it hoots around the space in the aerial domain, we seem to see other younger birds running and shouldering around, trying to hide away from the danger of which this giant hawk is about to pose. This is also an expression of abuse of power, intimidation of younger people by those in places of authority. In the last stanza, the poet says, the land lies patiently ahead. That line there is an expression of personification. The land there has been personified to perform the actions of human beings, which is the act of lying. He said the land lies patiently ahead in ambush. Those who point away from direction where nothing happens towards the shore of possibilities. I will explain that stanza very well. Now, it is very obvious that in post-colonial African societies, so many Africans are aiming at leaving their home countries in order to find greener pastures in well-developed countries away from home. Now, these dreams are always aborted largely. Now, it is clearly evident that the economic situation or the administration of some African countries are not too good enough. Therefore, people there, young aspirants, try to move away to other countries in order to make ends meet and then showcase their talent. But the poet speaker says that even if you have such a dream to move away from this land of which is not good enough to a better one, your own country will still abort that plan. When he says that the land lies patiently ahead, awaiting in ambush. And who is this land waiting for? Those who point away from the direction where nothing happens towards the shore of possibilities. If we must use Nigeria as a context, you could imagine the stringent measures that may be expected of a young Nigerian to leave the Nigerian context to another country. Apart from that, the stigma of which some Nigerians are facing in foreign countries is also not encouraging at all. All these are the expressions put forward by this poet when he said that the land is laying in ambush, awaiting those who may even want to move away from this domain to other shores where possibilities can likely happen. That is ambush. Now let's look at the themes in the poem. The first is the theme of abuse of power. The second is intimidation and frustration. And the third is despair or hopelessness. In the first theme, abuse of power, we can see clearly that it is embedded in the three major predators as used in the poem by the poet. When we talked about the giant hawk, the saber-toothed tiger, and then firstly the lion, which is also likened to a giant whale, all these are predators that abuse power. The whale is notable for swallowing younger fishes. The tiger is also a predator that hunts younger land animals. The hawk, the giant hawk of course, is also notable for using its strength to hunt younger and smaller birds. These metaphorical usages is simply notable in the theme of abuse of power, where the poet clearly employs these creatures in order to explain that African leaders in post-colonial eras are using their positions to oppress and suppress the dreams of young African youths. The second is intimidation and frustration. Now, if you quickly run with me to the second stanza of the poem, the poet says that the land is a saber-toothed tiger that cries deep in the glade while infants shudder home. That is a strong show of intimidation. Now, these leaders, as depicted in metaphorical usages of predators, use their positions to intimidate young people so that people are not free enough to even walk in the evening. While he said, because of these intimidations, it halts venturous walk at dusk. People don't move because they have used their powers to intimidate them. Now, even if you move to the next stanza, where he likened the land or the leaders as a giant hawk, it is clear that when this hawk showcases, a lot of birds, smaller birds, seem to be very intimidated. So the theme of intimidation and frustration, which is a follow-up, seems to be a strong tool in this poem. The third theme is the theme of despair and hopelessness. This theme is clearly important in the last stanza of the poem. He says that the land lies patiently ahead. Now, having clearly explained the level of intimidation, frustration, and abuse of power as showcased in the first three stanzas of the poem, the last stanza did not in any way show that there is an element of hope. It means that even when young Nigerians or Africans are planning to leave the country, the land is still waiting to frustrate that dream, therefore leaving everybody in a state of despair. He says, the land lies patiently ahead, are waiting in ambush. Those who point away from a direction where nothing happens towards the shore of possibilities. This is clearly an element of hopelessness, an element of despair. It shows that even when nothing is happening within the enclave of the African context, those who still want to move away will still experience hopelessness, despair, and frustration. Clearly, it is notable. Now, let's look at this question. In Adeoti's ambush, the leaders are depicted to be A. Democratic, B. Autocratic, C. Popular, and D. Competent. You will agree with me that the correct answer to that question is contained in option B, which is autocratic. Leaders in the poem Ambush are clearly depicted to be autocratic in nature. When you say leaders are autocratic, it simply means that they are dominating, they are domineering, they abuse their position. Of course, they practice the concept and the system of autocracy, which is the government ruled by power, force, without the show of the rule of law. Now, that is all you have to know about Adeoti's ambush. Sit tight as I will be taking you to our next video, which is on the panic of growing older by Henry Peters. Thank you very much.